Imagine waking up in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone is breathing behind you. But there are no footsteps, no shadow. No body. Only the sensation, the one that crawls down your spine like a thread of ice. That something is watching you long before you open your eyes. Now, take a deep breath, because what you are about to hear is not a common story. It's one of those narratives psychiatrists avoid commenting on, investigators prefer to archive, and historians mention only in footnotes, like someone trying to hide an open wound. A story where the human mind tears the boundary between reality and hallucination, and doesn't give the body time to choose which side it wants to stay on. In the first records, they called it episodes, later, delusions, and later still. When they realized the events left physical marks, they tried another name, cognitive shadows. But no definition was enough, because how do you explain a king, the most powerful man of his time, completely paralyzed with terror before something no one else could see? How do you describe the feeling of being alive, but being treated like a corpse by an entity that exists only inside your head? How do you convince someone that a shadow can whisper, that it can walk before you walk, that it can look at you without having eyes? In the lost archives of the Kingdom of Asterion, there is an account almost no one had the courage to translate, a document that seemed to be written by a trembling hand, smudging ink, scribbling margins, as if each word were written while the author fought something invisible. And right on the first page, the sentence the church tried to censor: "The thing that follows me knows what I'm going to think. Before I think." They say the king who wrote this was lucid, brave, rational, a brilliant strategist, but something in him broke, something that began as a shadow behind the door and ended as a presence that no longer needed to hide. And the worst part, it wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a demon, it wasn't a creature, it was himself, or the part of him that had always been lurking. Prepare yourself. From this point on, you are going to enter the mind of a man who fought the most brutal war that exists, the war against his own unconscious. And when you come out the other side, you will realize that some shadows don't follow you, they anticipate you. Before losing control of his own mind, King Alarien was known as the monarch of the two horizons, a cold, strategic leader with an almost supernatural ability to predict enemy movements before they happen. But no one knew that this very ability hid the beginning of his downfall. What started it? All was not a curse, nor a conspiracy, nor an illness. It was a lapse, a small error, so small no one would have noticed. But it marked the beginning of the most intriguing psychological collapse ever recorded. It all began on a silent dawn, when the king woke from a dream that felt more real than any battle he had ever faced. In the dream, someone was sitting in the chair beside the throne. Someone who breathed like him, moved like him, and had exactly the same face. But when Alarien opened his eyes, the room was empty, or almost empty, because the feeling remained. The feeling that another Alarien was still there, watching, just too quiet, too still. The physician said it was exhaustion. The priest suggested divine signs. The advisors blamed the stress of war. But then something impossible began to happen. The king predicted conversations before they existed, answered questions that had not yet been asked, interrupted dialogue seconds before someone opened their mouth. At first, it seemed like an extraordinary ability, almost magical. But to Alarien, it was torment. It was as if a silent voice were whispering everything into his mind seconds before reality happened. As if the shadow from the dream were living ahead of him, experiencing the world first, and leaving him only the leftovers. The official records were erased, but secret manuscripts say the king began writing disjointed phrases on the castle walls. "I am not alone inside myself. He knows before I do. The shadow wakes before I open my eyes." Then came the most disturbing episode. During a diplomatic dinner, Alarien froze at the table. His hand dropped the goblet, his gaze fixed on an empty point behind him. and with a trembling voice, he whispered, "He's here." No one saw anything, but the king saw everything. Something had taken form, something that looked human, but had no substance, a presence that imitated a Larian, breathed like a Larian, but was not a Larian. And at that moment, the story stopped being just a psychological problem and became a riddle that defies human understanding to this day. Who or what was this shadow? A fragment of the mind? A delusion that gained consciousness? Or a repressed part of the king himself, fighting to take control? The answer was never given, but the symptoms evolved, and the shadow began to act as if it had a will of its own. And this is where you, viewer, need to stay with me, because understanding what happened to the king is not just diving into an old case. It is facing a mirror that may reflect more than you expect. As stories like this fascinate you, if you enjoy diving deep into the darker side of the human mind, subscribe to the channel now. Here, every episode will take you down paths where psychology meets the unexplainable and reality becomes more fragile than it seems. After that night at the banquet, the entire castle began to witness, in terrified silence, the slow deterioration of the king. But what no one knew was that the shadow wasn't just watching, it was learning. It all began with small delays. The king would rise from bed and feel his own shadow take half a second longer to follow him, as if it were deciding whether it was worth imitating him. Then came the reflections, walking past the mirrors in the north corridor. Alarian noticed that his reflection blinked too late or too early. Sometimes it didn't blink at all. The physicians said they were illusions. The advisors said it was exhaustion. But the king said something else. He is trying to get out. Nights became Alarian's worst enemy. Servants reported hearing footsteps in the throne room even when the king was asleep. Slow, heavy. Ritualistic, and at dawn, objects would be out of place. The scepter on the wrong table, the crown on the floor, the throne chairs slightly turned, as if someone had sat on it for hours. No one admitted it aloud, but everyone felt it. There were two kings inside the castle, one alive and one forming. The most terrifying record came from a secret letter written by the captain of the guard. He described at dawn when he found the king standing before the stone wall, staring at it as if an invisible door were there. When the captain called his name, Alarian didn't turn his face, but his shadow did. It turned its head slowly, as if annoyed for being interrupted, and the king's head remained still. The captain fled that same week. The more time passed, the more the shadow gained coherence, as if it were absorbing pieces of the real world, pieces of routine, pieces of the king's emotions. Their relationship stopped being persecution and became something even more macabre, competition. The shadow anticipated his thoughts, completed his sentences mentally, imitated his gestures before he made them. It was as if it were saying, "I can be better than you." And then came the exchanges. On some mornings, the king appeared lucid, firm, present. On others, he appeared confused, unable to remember decisions made the previous day. Speeches changed, signatures changed, mood changed. The advisors began to suspect that perhaps, on certain days, it was not Alarian who ruled, but the event that marked the beginning of the end was a simple detail. The one historian Thalum described as the quietest and most terrifying moment in the kingdom's history. One late afternoon, as the king walked through the main hall, his shadow stopped and did not return to follow him. It stayed there, motionless, watching the king walk away, like someone observing a prey beginning to tire. And for the first time, Alarian realized something that destroyed him inside. The shadow no longer needed him to exist. The collapse of King Alarian left scholars perplexed for centuries. It was not ordinary madness. It was not an isolated delusion. It was a phenomenon that seemed to follow a logic of its own, a pattern so complex that modern psychologists can only decipher parts of it. The first crucial point, the shadow was not an apparition. It was a projection of the unconscious. The human mind, when pushed beyond its limits, creates ways to survive. Some people develop phobias, others, emotional blockages. Others still create internal characters, voices, fragmented identities. In the king's case, this took on a visual form. Psychology calls this unconscious personification when a repressed trait, fear, guilt, aggression, gains a mental shape so intense that it seems to have a will of its own. But Alarion's story went further. He didn't just see the shadow. He interacted with it. He recognized it as an other. And that brings us to the second point, the phenomenon of cognitive doubling. It is when the mind creates a second self, a psychic copy that operates parallel to the conscious mind. In most people, this happens subtly, like when you argue with yourself, predict mistakes, or rehearse conversations before they happen. But in Alarion, this process became hypertrophied, gigantic, autonomous. This explains why the shadow anticipated him. The unconscious reacts faster than the conscious, always. That is why you feel fear before understanding the danger. That is why you make impulsive decisions before justifying them logically. The unconscious acts first. Reason runs behind. In the king's case, this difference of milliseconds became seconds, then minutes, and then days. Each emotional crisis, each sleepless night, each bloody political decision fed the second self, until it grew strong enough to gain perceptible form. And this is where psychology meets the impossible. Reports say the shadow didn't just anticipate him. It acted when the king didn't. Moving objects, imitating gestures, challenging the light. Traditional psychology rejects these accounts naturally. But there are real medical records, not from Alarion's era, but from the last 40 years, describing patients who claim to feel parts of themselves acting independently. They are rare, extremely rare, but they exist. Patients who say that another version of themselves thinks faster, corrects them, criticizes them, tries to replace them. In many of these cases, the common point is the same: trauma plus isolation plus insomnia plus extreme self-pressure equals identity disintegration. Exactly what Alarion was living. He wasn't sleeping. He carried an entire kingdom on his back. He was pressured by wars, betrayals, deadly decisions, and above all, he repressed all this weight as if nothing were happening. The body endures, the mind does not, and when it breaks, it does not break quietly. It breaks by creating monsters. But the most disturbing part of all is a hypothesis defended by a single researcher, the psychoanalytic historian Varin. The shadow did not want to destroy Alarion. It wanted to replace him. This would explain the delayed reflections, the independent movements, the sense of duplicity, and most importantly, the fact that, over time, the shadow began acting as if it were the true king. The question, then, is no longer what was the shadow, but rather, who was ruling in those final days, Alarion or his unconscious version? From the moment the shadow stopped following Alarion, the kingdom witnessed a succession of events no one could explain. Events that forever changed the understanding of what was truly happening inside the castle. The first turning point happened on an apparently ordinary morning. The servants entered the throne room to clean and found the chairs positioned before the royal table, two identical, one facing the other. The disturbing detail was that only one of them existed. The day before, and on the wood of the newly appeared chair, there were nail marks, as if someone had gripped the armrest with extreme force, human force, or something trying to imitate it. When asked about it, Alarion replied, "I did not place this chair here, but I know who did." And he fell silent, a silence so absolute that none of the servants dared ask for explanation. Days later, the council began to notice something even more shocking: the political decisions issued by the king, the signatures, the decrees, the writing began to show the different handwriting styles. One was the firm, classical writing characteristic of Alarion, the other thinner, more precise, almost perfect. But with one detail: it didn't look written by a Human hand, it looked drawn, to crafted, to symmetrical. Meanwhile, the king's behavior oscillated between lucidity and darkness. Some mornings he barely spoke, others, he woke with a cold smile on his face, as if he knew something no one else knew. The physicians tried to intervene, but every time one examined him, they reported the same phenomenon, the sensation that there were two presences in the room, one visible, another not. The second turning point came during a violent storm. Lightning illuminated the castle like white blades. The guards, from their towers, swore they saw a figure standing on the rooftop. Not the king, but a tall, thin, motionless form with no facial features. Someone suggested it was a bandit, another, a ghost. But then a lightning strike hit close enough to reveal that a tale that froze everyone. The figure cast no shadow, and yet it seemed to be watching the king's chamber. The third unexpected event occurred in the Hall of Mirrors, the room Alaryon avoided ever since his reflections began. Behaving strangely, that night, as he passed by, he heard a crack behind him. When he turned, he saw his own reflection standing still. But Alaryon was not facing the mirror. He was sideways. The reflection, however, looked straight at him and smiled, a smile that did not belong to the king. The panic was so brutal that Alaryon fell to the floor, but the reflection kept smiling even as the king crawled away backward. Days later, the shadow began manifesting in clearer ways. Doors would close by themselves when the king approached. The fireplace would extinguish when he entered. The air temperature shifted with his mood. It was as if the entire castle reacted not to the king, but to the presence accompanying him. And then came the most devastating turning point of all, the one recorded in the archives as the night of the replacement. During dinner, Alaryon lifted a goblet to make a toast, but the shadow behind him lifted its goblet first. The guests saw, with their own eyes, two goblets raised, one real, one made of nothing, but visible enough to be perceived. And the shadow, instead of imitating the king, did something for the first time in history. It smiled before he did, and lowered its goblet first, as if it were no longer copying, as if it were leading. And Alaryon, for the first time, admitted aloud, he wants to be me. The night of the replacement marked the point of no return. From that moment on, the king was no longer fighting a delusion, but a psychic entity that seemed to have claimed half of his being, and the shadow was growing faster than he could resist. Witnesses described the climax as a silent war inside one man, but for Alaryon, there was no silence. There was noise, a constant noise, as if thoughts that were not his own were pounding against the walls of his mind, trying to push him out of his own body. That night, the shadow finally stopped imitating, stopped following, and decided to confront him. It began when the king entered the royal chamber, exhausted, broken, breathing like someone who had already accepted defeat. The moon illuminated only part of the room, and there, on the line between light and darkness, he saw it. The shadow was standing, but it was not attached to his feet. It was not bound to him. It was a separate figure, independent, like a being made of absence. It had no face, yet Alaryon felt it staring at him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice drowning in despair. No answer. The shadow merely tilted its head, like a predator studying its prey. Then it took a step that echoed inside the king's mind. Not on the floor, in the mind. Alaryon staggered backward, without the shadow touching him. Its mere movement seemed to push him emotionally, mentally, as if each gesture drained strength from his identity. He tried to run, but the shadow was already in front of the door, blocking, watching. The king's breathing accelerated until it became uneven. His heart pounded like a war drum. And then came the moment historians called the misalignment. Alaryon raised his hand to steady himself on a table, but the shadow also raised its hand, and its hand aligned perfectly with his, as if it were his exact copy, until, in one terrifying second, The shadow placed its hand on top of his, and Ilarion felt it. He felt cold. He felt absence. He felt something pulling his consciousness backward, like someone tearing a painting off a wall. No, nitrogen monoxide. He screamed, collapsing to his knees. The shadow brought its faceless face within inches of his, and in an instant, the king experienced the most brutal sensation of his life. He felt himself being vacated, as if his identity were being evicted from his own body. Visions surged. Moments from the past. Memories, victories, defeats, everything spinning like pages ripped from a book. It was as if the shadow were flipping through his life, choosing what it wanted to keep and what it would discard. The king cried, for the first time since childhood. But the tears did not fall because of fear. They fell because of something far more devastating. He realized the shadow was not his enemy. It was his successor. And then came the final blow. The shadow came even closer, until his outline overlapped Ilarion's body. And for the first time, the only time recorded in history, the shadow spoke. A single word, leave. It was a whisper, but it cut through the king like a blade. His body collapsed to the floor. His eyes lost focus, and for a few seconds, Ilarion stopped being Ilarion. When he opened his eyes again, no one, absolutely no one, could say whether the one standing there was the true king or the shadow that had finally taken his place. Some say Ilarion's gaze was never the same. Others swear he began acting far too perfectly, too logically, too coldly, as if a man made of emptiness were ruling behind the face of a human. After that night, the kingdom could no longer tell where the man ended and where the shadow began. The advisors reported that the new Ilarion, if it was still him, had an unnatural calm. He spoke little, decided quickly, never hesitated, never showed doubt, as if the weight of human emotions had evaporated. Some called it evolution, others, possession. But the truth is far darker. The shadow didn't destroy the king. It perfected him silently. It removed everything that makes a human being fragile: fear, insecurity, guilt, empathy, and left only calculation, control, absolute coldness, an improved version of Ilarion, but no longer human. And here is the reflection that still echoes among scholars of the mind. Is the shadow our dark side? Or is it our side that is too perfect? Think about it. We all have within us a silent version that observes, a part that thinks before the conscious mind, that judges without mercy, that knows when we are lying to ourselves, a part that feels no fear, yet makes us feel it. Psychology calls it the unconscious, religions call it the spirit, poets call it the shadow. But what truly frightens is that, in the absence of balance, this part dominates us. Not with violence, but with precision, just like what happened to the king. Maybe the shadow is not a monster. Maybe it is the warning, the reminder that when you ignore your emotions, your traumas, your fears, they don't disappear. They take shape, they grow in the dark, and one day, they knock on your door. What happened to Ilarion is not just an old story. It is a mirror. A reminder that fighting what we are inside is the quickest path to being replaced by what we tried to hide. If there is a lesson in this dark journey, it is this: face your shadow before it decides to face you. If you made it this far, it's because you are drawn to deep, psychological stories that play with the mind and challenge logic. And that is exactly what I bring on this channel. So subscribe now, not just to support the content, but because YouTube only recommends videos like this when you subscribe and engage. Your subscription tells the algorithm you want to keep receiving stories in this style, and it helps me create episodes even more intense than this one. Also, leave a like, because it tells YouTube that this video is worth spreading to more people. And I really want to know, what did you think of King Ilarion's story? Was the shadow his unconscious, or something beyond the human mind? Comment below. I'll read everything. And before you go, look at the screen. A video is already appearing that is even more intriguing, psychological, and addictive than this one. I guarantee it. Click on it now. Because if this one gripped you, The next will tear you apart from the inside.